Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I am John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
With us today is Karl Hughes. Karl is a technology team builder, software engineer, and startup enthusiast. He's CTO at the Grade Network and helps technology speakers succeed at CFP Land. Welcome, Karl.
Yeah, hey, good to be here, guys.
So, Karl, before we kind of jump into the meat of things, would you just give our listeners a little bit of background for yourself? Maybe tell them how you got started in the industry?
Yeah, sure. So I have been working with education technology startups for the past 8 years or so. Long before that, we were just talking before the show about our connection is Louisville, Kentucky, which we all have emanated from at some level. So I did my very first internship with GE Appliances in Louisville, Kentucky. I was working on washing machines. Yeah. And my best memory, or I don't know, funnest memory from that time was sitting in the basement where we do what they call black box testing on washing machines. And it's basically pressing every button in every combination that you could possibly imagine and writing it all down and then sending it up to the senior engineers who tell you, okay, we did a new version. Tomorrow you're going to do it again. And it's about the most soul-sucking kind of software development work you can do. But at the same time, you learn a lot. And it was a good intro to the industry, I suppose.
Okay, very cool. And then, so what are you doing these days? You say there's CTO?
So, more recently, and more recently, I've been working for the Grade Network now for about 4 years. We grade papers for K through 12 teachers. The way it works is we have a pool of college students who work around the country remotely to grade essays for teachers that work with us. And so it's kind of a weird thing. It's not something that other companies are doing. We work with several dozen schools in the U.S. and a couple of districts now as well. So early stage startup, but it gave me the opportunity a couple years ago to start I got the bug to start speaking and kind of got into architecture, explaining some of the things we had built, some of the reasons that we built things the way we had. One of the fun things about working with a small early stage startup is you make a ton of greenfield decisions that a lot of developers don't get the opportunity to do. And obviously I screwed a lot of those up in the early days. And so the great thing is that when you go and talk about that, you can talk about the pros and cons because you've lived the cons and the pros. And so that got me into speaking a couple of years ago. I started by applying to about 50 conferences my first year. I got 7 acceptances and 6 of them actually happened. One of the conferences got canceled for no fault of mine. But that happens, and that's one of those things you find out as you start speaking. And then going through that whole thing, like finding 50 CFPs that were appropriate to submit to meant I had this huge spreadsheet of CFPs. And from there, I had decided I'd just start mailing out all the ones that closed soon to my friends who also spoke. And maybe 6 months to a year later, I'd set up a landing page and CFP Land was born. And so that's been my side project for the last about year and a half now.
Very nice. So I would imagine working on in a startup and making some of those early decisions that it's pretty easy to worry and stress about the decisions that you make. So it sounds like you didn't really worry. Maybe you iterated over a couple of different choices and progressed from there. What were some of those early decisions that maybe plagued you or that you stressed about making?
Yeah, what's interesting is they range from the very low level, like what database are we going to use and how are we going to index it, to the very high level, what does the user experience need to be and how do we deliver, like how often do we deliver software and all those kinds of things. So it's really hard. I think that's one of the things that is most challenging about this role, where in the early days you're doing everything. I found what was really helpful was to find a good group of mentors, some of them local to Chicago, some of them abroad and that I connect with remotely, as well as listening to podcasts, obviously, it's a big one, but also just reading books. There's an interesting book called The Architecture of Open Source Applications that I read a couple years ago. And it goes through all the messy and weird decisions that were made to build these huge open source projects. And you just realize when you read that, oh, okay, my software is bad, but all software is bad. And that's okay. Like that we're all just trying to make it a little better all the time. But the business requirements are changing on us. Anyway, so some of the decisions, just to get more tangible, are like, are we going to go with a microservice architecture? Are we going to try to build a big monolith? Are we going to use separated front and back end? Are we going to use PHP as a language? Or are we going to use Node as a language? Or are we going to use Python? Or are we going to try to follow every trend of which framework is hot today? Or are we going to just kind of stick with what we know? And those kind of decisions are really hard to go back on once you've made them. And so you kind of have to live with them. And there's, the things you sort of learn along the way. But I really enjoy it as well. So I think that it's a unique opportunity, and it's a chance that, like I said, not a lot of developers at larger companies get that chance.
Mm-hmm.
So going back in your answer there just a little bit, you mentioned finding mentors. What processes did you use to go out and find those mentors? I mean, that's one of the more difficult things to do in our industry, is to find somebody that is knowledgeable enough and willing to help. So do you have any tricks or anything that you could share that would help other people do the same?
Absolutely. The big one is staying in touch with people. So what I realized at some point was that I would meet people. Let's say I go to a meetup and I meet the speaker briefly and I say, hey, this was a great talk. And then that's the end. And I never talk to that person again. That's not very useful to me or the speaker. And what I found was that it started off with another spreadsheet. I kept a spreadsheet of all the people that I sort of wanted to keep in touch with, because maybe they were peers, or maybe they were a little ahead of me in their career, or a little behind me in their career, and I wanted to help bring them along and keep in touch with them. That has paid off dividends much greater than I can explain. So some tangible examples of that. I got in touch with somebody who, I guess this is how I got my current job. I met the founder somewhere. I really liked her idea. She had basically no software developer working with her, so she was completely had no idea where she was going to go from there. We stayed in touch. A few months later, she got some funding and she hired me on. And then just recently, this last month, I just hired a developer because I've stayed in touch with her for 2 years from meetups we've gone to, and I actually spoke at her boot camp that she went to. And you can't do that unless you intentionally stay in touch with people. So start a spreadsheet, and when you do get the chance to meet people, just kind of put them in that spreadsheet if you liked them. And every 6 months, send them an email and say, hey, how's it going? Want to get coffee? Want to grab a quick lunch maybe? It takes time, and it's one of those things that you have to invest sort of in your network and in finding mentors, because it doesn't happen easily overnight.
Yeah, that's what I really enjoy about the speakers groups, the user groups, the conferences. It seems like there's a really helpful network, and everybody's really encouraging and supportive of one another. The three of us used to work in Louisville, Kentucky, and attended the .NET user group there, and the CodePalooza conference in the summer, or various times of the year when it was scheduled, and then still go back to that conference once a year and see the same familiar faces and rekindle those relationships that we might have kind of let languish a little bit in our absence. But just looking on Twitter about the supportive community on Twitter, and the past couple of weeks reading about a lot of our friends that have gone to the Antarctic conference, Antarctic Conf, this past couple of weeks, and really looking forward to them bringing back penguins for everybody. It's really encouraging to see the community supportive of those that are interested in speaking and sharing.
Yeah, I would agree. I found the speaker community to be one of the more helpful of all the technical communities. And I think it sort of makes sense, because when you volunteer to speak at a conference, rarely do you get paid. Rarely do you get any direct sort of tangible benefit, but you're helping hundreds or dozens of people in the audience learn something new, or learn that it's okay to screw up, or whatever it is that your talk is getting to. And I think that sort of means it attracts people who are naturally kind of helpful. And so I've been in some speaker Slack chat groups or Slack groups and some Twitter groups, just kind of people and staying in touch with them. And then, like you said, you see them at the same conferences every year. For me, it's Midwest PHP is kind of my people. And whenever I get to go, it's like, there's everybody I know. I know that guy, that woman, that guy, and it's a lot of fun. It gives you this way to keep in touch with people too that you wouldn't normally get to do otherwise.
Yeah, and I've submitted to a variety of different local user groups and both national and international conferences. And even if my talk isn't submitted, I usually get pretty good feedback as to why, or maybe how I could improve it, how I could improve the abstract in order to maybe be selected at a future conference. You had mentioned that you submitted your first venture into speaking. You submitted to a number of different places to speak. What types of venues were those?
Yeah, well, the first year I was not as selective as I am now, and partly it was just like I had no idea what I was submitting and what these conferences were like, and if anybody was going to say yes. I've always felt like, okay, I can speak okay, but I've never written an abstract, so I had no idea what that was going to be like. Anyway, I looked at a couple. There's a few different kinds of conferences that you could target. One is the sort of regional technology specific ones. So you mentioned like the .NET user group that kind of goes out to maybe a state or two, and then that's like a little .NET regional conference, or there's .NET national conferences, I'm sure, as well. Same in PHP and in JavaScript. All these communities have like a regional and some national and international conferences. So you can kind of go technology specific. And then there's some sort of broad ones that cover a ton of things. So Code Mash is a really good example. I think they have like 2,000 or 3,000 developers go every year. It's just wild to see. And for that, they cover so many different technologies and non-technical and technical talks that a lot of stuff gets accepted, and they have like 10 tracks running at once. So if you want to speak, those kind of big conferences that cover a broad range, sometimes that can be good. And then there's kind of leadership focused and team focused conferences. So the lead developer is a really well-known, good one that has, I think, 3 locations now. They do London, New York, and maybe still Austin, Texas. And that kind of conference, it's a little more like softer talks, managerial talks, what it's like making the architectural decisions. So you're getting out of the like technology specific stuff and into higher level things. So all those can be good, and you have to know which talk goes with which conference and which audience. And that is probably the hardest thing, and also the thing that I screwed up the most, and most new speakers screw up.
So what are some of the ways that you help speakers sort of kind of hone their abstracts and find the right conferences to submit to or whatnot? Do you do that?
Yeah, so I personally, I've done a little bit of one-on-one mentoring with friends who ask for like help with abstracts, and there's a speaker Slack group that I've been in that has also, there's people who do that, and I've done a little bit of that. But mostly with CFP Land, it's mostly just about finding the open CFPs and then offering blog posts that sort of give you a little more advice and digest a lot of things that I've learned. So last year I got to interview about 35 speakers who were speaking at international and events around the country as well. And in all those interviews, I kind of asked speakers some key things, like how do they find CFPs? How are they sort of selecting which ones are right for them? What are some of the biggest mistakes they've made, and tips for new people? And so it was really great to get all this advice and then distill it down to this one big guide that now is available on the site. So with that, there's a big section on writing abstracts and on picking the right conferences. And so there's a whole lot there, but the biggest one is sort of knowing who your audience is for the conference and who it is for your talk. So I'll give you an example of how you screwed this up. I one time submitted a talk to a conference that was like it was more for, I'll call them like website administrators. So people who run Drupal sites and WordPress sites, and they tend to be more on the design side and the administrative side. And my talk was about testing distributed software systems. And so it was it was not the right talk for that audience. And it got accepted, which I think, they probably thought, oh, well, he's going to figure out a way to merge it in with the audience. And no, I didn't, because I'm an idiot. And so I got up there and I could tell there was just a lot of blank stares. And so I was like, okay, I'm like kind of doing it live. Like, I got to back off and like make this digestible and, put this in the right level. It's really hard to do if you didn't prepare for that. So I'm now much more careful, but you have to learn those kind of things by just doing it.
Okay.
What types of talks did you submit in those early days?
So I found initially a lot of the talks that got accepted were ones around specific technical topics, kind of similar to what you'd give at a meetup. I think that those are maybe a good place to start, because every conference wants a certain number of really hard, new, cutting-edge technical talks. And as I've kind of done it a little longer, I've been trying to shift a little more towards, I guess, like softer talks or higher level talks about decisions and managing teams. Lately, the one I've been giving and pitching a lot is on writing less code. So I think one of the things that I've noticed in the last 10 years of writing software is that the underlying tools to get us to a workable sort of minimum level are so much better than they were 10 years ago. And I think it goes even further. They're better than they were 20 years ago. So in other words, you can start with a framework that gives you a ton of features out of the box when you start a new project, or you can go find an API that does a lot of things for you, and you don't have to go build a PDF converter on your own. There's nothing wrong with building PDF converters, but I'm really lazy. And so I think it's really great when somebody else has one that I can pay $20 a month for, and that's so cheap compared to my time that it's well worth doing. I don't have to maintain it. So there's things like that. There's tricks like that that I think developers need to sort of pull out of their general, like, I must build it, and if it's not built here, then it's not good. It's just it's hard to do that, because there are some risks when it comes to picking someone else's technology instead of your own, but there are definitely risks when you build everything yourself from scratch. So yes.
So for anyone interested in the guide that you mentioned earlier, what topics are actually covered in the guide, and where might they find the guide?
Yeah, so CFPland.com, there's a link just after the sort of header thing that mentions, let's see what it says. It says like comprehensive guide to speaking at conferences. You could also look for on Google CFP Land guide, and that'll come up. But basically what I did was kind of walked through, let's pretend you're completely new to speaking. You've never even been to a tech conference. What do you have to do to go from that to actually delivering your first talk? Mm-hmm. And I sort of started off with just what are tech conferences. So it's very like, if you've been to a bunch of tech conferences, you can skip that section. And as it goes, it's like, why do people want to go speak instead of just attend the conference? How do the conferences actually choose their speakers? So there's a CFP process, but like, what are they looking for? And that kind of thing is really hard to figure out until you talk to some organizers or you read some blog posts from organizers, and they tell you, it's about these things that sometimes you wouldn't expect. There's finding the right CFPs for your talk and your audience again. There's submitting abstracts and actually writing them, the sort of technical writing that goes into them. And there's a lot of great tips in there that I've pulled from other people and that people have given me along the way. Then there's actually like making your presentation and like delivering the slides, which is a whole nother skill set. It's interesting, when you speak, you have to have two skill sets that are not necessarily the same. You have to be able to write what you're going to talk about, and then you have to actually deliver on what you're going to talk about. And then you got to make slides along the way too, or some kind of like visual aid. And it's really hard to do all of those things. It takes a lot more time than I think people anticipate. And then, finally, like the last bit is just kind of the logistical things you should know preparing to go to your first conference. I, for example, it just kind of assumed that when a conference accepts me as a speaker, that means the conference is going to happen, and the organizers will just tell me all I need to know, and I'll just sit back and wait. That is a dangerous assumption to make, and I found that one out the hard way as well. But I think it's like being proactive with your communication is a big one there. And so each of these sections kind of dives in. The whole thing's about 17,000 words, so it's a kind of a short book, but you can kind of pick and choose the areas that you're most interested in based on where you're at in your speaking journey.
So in your assembling this information for the guide and putting together your thoughts and gathering thoughts from those that accept abstracts. What are the items that we should be thinking about when putting together abstracts for our talks?
Yeah. So some of the things that I've noticed a lot of speakers talk about, besides just fitting the conference, is like, is it actually an exciting topic to you? Is it something that you will go up on stage and deliver with enthusiasm, or is it something that you just think is like, well, I could talk about that, you know? The speakers who are really sort of top tier get really jazzed up about what they're talking about. And then the other side of that is, do you actually know that topic? So again, if you go up on stage and you just learned, you know, you walk through your first intro to React tutorial, and then you just go regurgitate that on stage and somebody asks you a question that's outside of your depth, it's going to be tough and you're going to struggle. And that's maybe not the, you know, the best place to do that. On the other hand, if you've been working with Postgres for 5 years, which a lot of developers sure have been working with a database for 5 years, you probably have picked up 2 or 3 things that most developers don't know. And you probably don't even realize that. So there's these unique kernels of knowledge that people have because they work in a certain industry or a certain field for long enough that sometimes they just take for granted. I was talking to a friend the other day. He was saying, I have no idea what to speak about. And I was asking about some of his projects at work. And he says he just went through internationalizing an app. I have never done internationalization. I've always worked for companies where we were only in the US. It didn't matter. But that is a huge challenge. And I was like, I would love to hear that. Like that's a talk that you could deliver at every conference in the country or the world, because every developer runs into this and it's very hard. And it's notoriously hard. The other things that come up are, it's kind of like some of these things are definitely you must do. And some of these things are a little more like encouraged, but not necessarily always the case. So some speakers that I've talked with have mentioned they want their talks to make the world a quote unquote better place in some way. And so maybe that means making code cleaner. Maybe it means increasing diversity in our industry. Maybe it means making environmental priorities more forefront of people's minds. And so that can mean a lot of different things. And there's no, it's not like every talk has to make the world a better place necessarily, but I think to some extent they do, because hopefully people are learning from it. And the other one that a lot of speakers point to, the last thing I'll mention, is making your talks actionable. And I thought this was really interesting because a lot of talks are kind of like the same thing I could have gotten by just reading the tutorial. And I think that's a weakness that a lot of speakers sort of point out with newer speakers. It's like maybe they don't realize they should go beyond, or they should tell a personal story. Those kind of personal stories and like, here's a problem, here's the solution we used, are very actionable. Whereas the whole like, here's how you set up React app for the first time is like, well, I don't know that that's something, I mean, you can go find that online. So trying to make that content unique is a big deal. But I also would not discourage speakers from just trying, even if you are giving a talk on something that's been done a million times and it's not the most novel thing. Just get up there and do it, because the more comfortable you get, the easier it is to deliver that next talk, and you'll get better at it over time. So like anything, you have to start and go through that painful beginner phase, or else you're never going to get to that great, that glorious mountain of expert phase, which I feel like I'm still very much working my way up that mountain. I'm a long way from the top. So
yeah, and I would say start at your local user group, because Clayton and I run a user group here in the Tampa St. Pete, Florida area, and we're always very open and welcoming to new speakers. So if you want to just get your feet wet, maybe even see if there's an opportunity to do a 15-minute lightning talk, then reach out to your local user group, because I'm sure they'd be more than willing to have you come in and speak.
Yeah, I run a meetup group here as well, and it's this. Our 2 biggest problems are finding sponsors and speakers. And if you are willing to do either of those, I'm willing to talk to you anytime, any day. Yeah, like you've got my phone number if you want it. So I agree. I think, and that's how I started too. I actually started off by giving my talks at local meetups and local area boot camps. So this is another one that's kind of a new thing. There's all these coding boot camps coming up all over the country, especially in bigger cities. And they're always looking for people from industry to come in and tell their students a little bit about what it's like actually working out there. It's a great way to practice speaking. You can give them, it's a great way also to test your talks for beginner friendliness, which is important because a lot of times, there are exceptions to this, but a lot of times you want your talks to be like digestible by anyone, even if they don't get all of the nuances and every tiny little piece of information. You want someone who's never used your technology that you're talking about to at least kind of be able to follow along and get something out of it. So I found that really helpful to go to those boot camps and practice talks there. So I would get, if I get the blank faces there, it means I'm probably going to get some blank faces in the conference. I don't want that. So I need to back off here.
I just assume people show up to the conference with their blank face and they never change it. So one of my favorite kinds of talks to give is more dangerous, I guess, and fraught with peril. I thoroughly enjoy giving live coding talks, which usually involves me starting with something I want to show the audience and falling flat on my face and then having to fix it in front of the audience. It's a bit of an adrenaline rush, and John likes to see me fail. So
let me clarify and say that I enjoy watching Clayton's live coding demos because if he encounters a problem, it is very entertaining watching him recover, and it's very it's very worthwhile to see how one deals with that unexpected behavior and recover from it, because I've been to talks where an unexpected error occurred and it kind of tanked the rest of the talk. So I'm much more inclined to be supportive and learn from how the individual is recovering from that.
In the regard to live coding, though, do you have any advice that you might give to somebody surrounding live coding? Either avoiding it or getting through it and winning instead of falling on your face?
Yeah, so this came up several times in the interviews I did and pulling together some different sources for tips for speakers. And a lot of people just say they avoid live coding because of exactly the reasons that you mentioned, is that it is risky. And you have to know there's a good chance that you're going to get up there and whatever you prepared doesn't work, the Wi-Fi doesn't work, or something doesn't work, video feed doesn't pick up your monitor for some reason, and you can't control all that. And so you're going to have to either be comfortable enough to sort of make it up as you go. And some people are good improvisers, or maybe you've been writing enough code long enough that you can just figure it out and you'll make something productive that people will get. I've also seen people fall flat on their face and not be able to pick it back up, and the audience kind of jumped in and tried to, like, one of the audience members got up on stage with him and tried to help him kind of navigate through, which was great. I mean, it's, again, the supportiveness of the community. Hopefully we're trying to help each other here, but you don't want to be in that situation. It's not comfortable. So until you're very comfortable, like coding on stage, there's some things you can do to get yourself ready for it if you decide to go with live coding. One is you can practice beforehand with the actual equipment that you'll be using for the conference. So if you get to the conference early, maybe the day before or the morning of, and you ask the AV people, or you should check with them beforehand, but can I go ahead and plug into the monitor and see how my live coding works, make sure it all works with the actual Wi-Fi you'll be using. You can have a video backup to go to, which I think is a super great idea. If I were ever doing live coding, I would probably have just, GIF recordings to back up to, or something like that, that I could just show. Another kind of method is to basically just give people the link and say, like, here's a step-by-step tutorial. I'm just going to sort of show you the highlights here rather than try to do it all live, which I think could also, that's kind of how I've done it when I've done live-ish coding, is I've said, I'm just going to skip to this step, but if you want all the steps, they're up on GitHub. Here's the link for that.
Okay. I should probably do some of those.
Please don't. It's so much more.
But yeah, there is something to be said for if you are a relatively new coder and you're in the audience and you see someone who's been doing this for 20 years go up there and screw it up, it kind of makes you feel, okay, I'm not the only one. I know there's now this whole there's this whole world of people who code live on Twitch, which I can't imagine people watching. You guys, yeah, we're too old. We don't get it. I don't know, but like that, and it's when you watch a little snippets of that, it's like you realize, first of all, most of what they do is just stare at the screen because that's what coding is. You're just thinking, and then second of all, when they screw something up, you're like yelling at the monitor, like, it's that you missed the semicolon right there, and of course they don't see it. It's anyway, so it is kind of good to show that you have flaws too. It's not all bad.
And earlier you mentioned that it's a couple of different skills to be able to put together a talk. It's writing the abstract. It's putting together your notes. It's maybe assembling code if it's a code heavy example or talk, and it's public speaking. It's delivering the talk. Do you have any specific advice or tips and tricks for those in their initial delivery, or like what do you do with your hands? What do you how do you participate with the audience? How do you interact with the audience? Where do you put the emphasis on the correct syllable?
Yeah. So the actual delivery part, there's kind of two sides. There's the planning and structure side, and then there's the actual mechanics of delivering the talk. So do you want to use your hands? Do you want to have a mic on your lapel versus a mic that you're holding? Are you ready for both? Because you never know what the conference is going to give you. I actually know speakers who bring their own mics because they just want to know the equipment that they're working with, which honestly, having had a couple mics screw up, it's not a bad idea. And I'm fortunate that I'm loud enough that I think I just make up with it by yelling at the audience. I don't know that they appreciate that, but not good for every speaker. So a couple things that came up. One that was really fun was asking all the speakers, how do you prepare in those moments leading up to getting on stage? And one of my favorites was Alex, I think his last name is Lakota. He talked about going into the bathroom before the talk, and he starts beating on his chest and just yelling like he won. And he's like, it doesn't matter what I won, I just won. And it's like his pump up routine. And he said more than once somebody's walked out of the other stall and been like, oh my gosh, this guy's got a problem. But and maybe you can do that in a simpler way. I know other people listen to pump up music, or they for me, I walk around the conference, and then I maybe try to have 2 or 3 conversations so I can warm up my voice or just warm up my talking motor or whatever. Something that gets you kind of going. Other people, though, they sit in their room quietly until the moment they get on stage. So I think a little bit of it is finding what works for you in the prep phase. Once you actually get on phase, ideally you've practiced so much and in front of a mirror and with a recording of yourself that it is no surprise what you do when you get on stage. You know what your hands are going to do. You know how many times you're hopefully going to say or not say or sort of be quiet or forget your line or whatever. What I like to do is practice my opening line really strongly. And then from there, I kind of have bullet points that I know I want to hit. I personally don't use speaker notes, but I know a lot of speakers do. And I think that can be really good, helpful. I find that if I have them, I look at them too much. And so I try to just kind of know my slides well enough. But I think that one of the big things that came out in talking with all these speakers was that the majority of the ones who are very successful speakers and do a lot of it practice a ton. And so they make it look easy, but it's because they spent a lot of time prepping. And they've been giving these talks. They may have like a rotation of 5 or 6 talks that they've given for years. And they may have cleaned them up and changed them over time. But when you look in the audience, you're like, wow, that is a really good speaker. But the truth is they've done this 30, 40, 50 times. And so you give yourself a little bit of a break, but also start thinking, how do I prepare that well? How do I get myself to a point where there is no mystery when I get on stage? I know what's happening.
So you've mentioned that the CFP Land and the guide that you have. Are there any other resources that you could point people to that may be looking to get into public speaking or speaking at conferences, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. There's I have another page, and it's linked from the guide, and it's the earliest blog posts I wrote. It's basically just a big collection of speaker resources. The one that always comes up in conversation is VM Brasseur. I think that's how you say her last name. She has been speaking for many years in consulting, and she's written books, and she's been compiling this huge open source list. So if you look up VM Brasseur, and I'm sure y'all can get a link in the show notes, like her public speaking guide and like list of resources is top tier. It's even, I think, in couple languages now. So that's a really great one. There's also, let's see if I can find what it's called. I'm going to have to look up the name of it. It might be. This is my live coding foul up here. I'll have to look it up. There's another guy who has a whole website that's got like 20, 30 pages, and it covers a lot of similar ground to what the guide for CFP Land does. It's been around a while too, so it's another great resource, and I definitely pulled a couple quotes from him in the guide too. So there's some links there.
Awesome. I'm sure that if you can look that up, we can always include it in the show notes.
We will do that.
Awesome. To kind of go in another direction, one of the questions we ask everyone that comes on is to sort of give specific advice to people who are just getting started in the industry. Maybe they're looking to like level up or just break into things. What kind of words of wisdom would you give them? Yeah,
I have been doing these talks at boot camps for several years. So this question comes up all the time, that I meet with at least probably one or two boot camp grads every week to just kind of, they ask to get coffee or follow up on these things. And I have several things that I point to. The first one is focus on meeting people, because they are the best long-term investment in your career. A lot of recent boot camp grads, as well as college grads, they spend all their time applying to jobs in mass and just the spray and pray approach. And you will eventually get a job when you do that. I don't mean to say that it doesn't work, but it is not nearly as beneficial to getting the right job for you as meeting people and knowing what it's actually like working at these places, especially when you talk about your second and third job. So invest in relationships and people. And the second thing that I always tell new developers is go deep in one language first. That's just my opinion. I know there's other people that say the other. I think, though, that learning one language, whether it's JavaScript or Python or Ruby or PHP, doesn't really matter. It teaches you, by going really deep and knowing what that language is, knowing several of the frameworks in it, you get to be really useful for that first job. So when somebody says, well, we'd like to hire you, but you've done the how-to tutorial in 10 different languages, like, what do you actually know, in a real world situation? You don't know much. And that's where we all started. If you can drill in on one narrow thing, it actually helps a lot. And then the great thing is, once you've learned one language really, really well, it's actually not that hard to transfer most of those skills to a second language. Programming languages are not as different as people think. So.
Okay. How about if our listeners want to sort of follow you more? Is there a specific place on social media, or what's that? Where can they find you?
Yeah. I'm on Twitter at Karl L. Hughes, and Karl spelled with a K. So, you got to, you wouldn't know that just by listening. And I'm always, I also have the CFPLand.com, and there's a newsletter there if you want to, get calls for proposals. But otherwise, you can, find my email on Twitter or LinkedIn. It's all on there. So you can email me directly if you want to ask questions or follow up. But I love helping out new developers. That's education has always been one of my passions. So I appreciate every contact that I get to have.
Excellent. One last question. Do you have any upcoming speaking engagements that you can shout out yourself?
Yeah, I'll shout out myself. I actually toned it way down on speaking the last few months. I had, my wife had a baby 14 weeks ago. So that's my next one. Developer First is what it's called.
Very cool.
All right. Well, thanks, Karl. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
That was Karl Hughes. Karl is a technology team builder, software engineer, and startup enthusiast. He's CTO at the Grade Network and helps technology speakers succeed at CFP Land.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com. Others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.